Good morning, everybody. And after 2 weeks in Warsaw, today we're traveling to Vienna. I think Vienna, unlike Warsaw, which was pretty much destroyed, during the war, here we're coming to a city that is still in its glory. I think you're going to really enjoy this. To introduce our speaker today, Carla Ruffer, who's really her inspiration for this program. She's the coordinator for the Center for European Studies, and she'll introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Ron. Hello again. I'd like to introduce Morgan Rich. She is the Assistant Director at CES at UF, and she holds a PhD in Historical Musicology from UF, an MM in Musicology from Bowling Green State University, and a BS in Music History and Literature from Indiana State University. She is also a research ambassador for DAAD, which in German stands for Deutscher Akademischer Austauschdienst. Close.
Very close.
Close. Austauschdienst, which translates to German Academic Exchange Service. So here's Morgan.
Well, good morning, you all. And if at any point my volume decreases and you need it to be louder, you just give me a nudge up, and I'll use more of my teacher voice and the microphone. I am really thrilled to be here with you all today. Would you all give me a head nod or a wave, or if you have visited Vienna before in your Vienna? The enthusiastic yeses are warming to my heart. I came to Vienna as a student through books because, as Carla told you, I started in music history and German language in my undergraduate degree and didn't know what any of that would mean. But the architecture, the building on top of building and destroying and rebuilding, plus the music history was kind of mind-boggling. And as a researcher, I approach Vienna from the early part of the 20th century. My focuses are music that would have been considered modern and a little scandalous at the time. And I've had the great fortune to do research in some of the archives, which are in some of the associated buildings we'll talk about today. So the approach I took, because I thought the percentage of you who have visited Vienna might be rather high. It is one of the most visited cities in Europe, mostly by Europeans and non-Americans, but Americans find their way to Vienna quite often after London, Paris, and Rome. Then Vienna is a fantastic city. If you've taken a river cruise, which I haven't done yet, but it is a great stop off. But I wanted to start with Vienna's musical landscape because we might know the city from whatever decade we visited in, but the landscape of the city and the buildings that house music and were built for music or used for that purpose make up the skyline and the unique structure, as we see from an late 18th century imaging map overlooking Vienna. We see the central figure there in the center, Stephen's Dome, Stephen's Dome, or cathedral. It is an archbishop seat of the Catholic Church, and it has existed in that place, some sort of worship/ceremonial space since Roman times, but the cathedral as a religious, Catholic religious space since the 12th century. But it is a landmark for music. I don't know about you, but I was dropped off in front of it, and it said, you can walk anywhere and look up and get back here to our meeting point because it towers over the city. So I thought if we start with, or if we take the approach of the musical landscape, we get a little bit of the history through the Holy Roman Empire, through the as it then transitions to the Habsburgs, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and a bit into the 20th century, but looking at it from this angle might be a different approach. So, yes.
Sorry, I'm just gonna.
Do we need?
Okay. Maybe just angle it that way.
Okay. Does that make it a little better? Thank y'all. So we have the busts from left to right of Franz Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Ludwig van Beethoven. These are the Viennese classicists. They center classical musical life. When we use the term classical music, it's just, I should have a symphony or a string quartet or a song playing for you right now, but we think of them. But how do we get to them and the city that supports them? What role do they have in kind of promoting the landscape? And what role do they have in seeing Vienna as more than just that ring surrounded by the Danube, but Franz Joseph Haydn, for instance, worked with Hungarian nobility in summer and hunting palaces, providing the music for their life outside of Vienna, but deeply embedded in Vienna. Mozart, we know, wasn't born there, but had this kind of tremendous life in Vienna, and same with Beethoven, born in Bonn, made his life. So they'll come up, and a little out of the chronology, but to make their impact. So I have for you as you can see, a 17th century, late 17th century printing of a map of Vienna. And this is the printing of the map of Vienna I want us to start with. I want us to start with sound and structure in a walled, moated city that was building out from its medieval origins into a city that was a capital of this portion of the Holy Roman Empire, that was a seat for the Catholic Church, our large, can you see the yellow on it? The yellow church colored in the orangish gold down towards the middle right is the Hof, or the imperial kind of palaces and civic functionary. We see the walled city and the ramps into it. We see that there is the capability for a moat, fantastic. And we see the ring around the city. And then expanding outwards into the green up in the left here is a kind of hunting palace and garden that becomes transposed later. And then we have, of course, the arms of the Danube, the main arm of the Danube that focuses on the city. So I want us to start here to think of the closed off walled city that is also a center of wealth and a center of the Catholic Church in this region. There are immense amounts of travelers from, we'll come to it in a second, the Ottoman Empire, from Hungary, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, these countries that we would call today. And there's a huge influx of languages and cosmopolitan nature in this closed off and sometimes considered a backwater city at this time, but it has many different lives. So the life of our city is built around Stephansdom and the imperial palaces. But if we think of the main cathedral as one of the places for the key civic functions from, as you can see, we have the stone foundation stone for the church all the way back in the 12th century. But this is a Gothic cathedral. The front entry you see here with the throngs of people lined up out front makes its kind of facade completed in the 13th century, but the Gothic construction throughout the Renaissance and into the Baroque period, we get this kind of finishing of it and its seat. But I bring it up in this early part because the Holy Roman Emperors are trading and funding musicians. They're funding musicians coming from their outposts in Milan, in the Franco-Flemish area, so up by Belgium. They are bringing people from Spain. They are bringing people from France. And I want us to start with the sounds and ideas of this early cosmopolitan city because it's not one that we typically think of, but it is one that displays its civic and trading, mercantile, and political pride through the music and the art and the architecture, which we see represented here. But also, if we imagine being in the interior of this cathedral around I'm moving us in time very quickly, around 1550s to 1600, Heinrich Isach is a born French speaker from the northern lowlands in Belgium, but he is a Germanophile true and true. He works for the Holy Roman Empire and ends up in cathedrals after going to Milan, over into Graz in Austria, and then his music ends up in the archives in Vienna. It is notated as performed in the cathedral as part of high holy ceremonies, if we imagine a Christmas or Easter service, in this environment, and it reflects the tastes of the era. So tastes that are moving from what is Italian polyphonic music, vocal music with many lines that are equal. The text is in Latin, it's for a service, and this would have been sought after to showcase the gilding of the cathedral as it grows and grows, the artwork, but the musical flourishing of this time in this space sounds like this. Now I stop it after the high male voices come in, but have you all sung in choirs before or enjoy it? This is a very high art piece of vocal imitation, one voice after another, like Johann Sebastian Bach and his fugues for the organ. It's a similar style, but for voices. And it's essentially a text that hails Mary. So we know that this is a devotional piece. We know that it is meant to be one of the most flourishing, kind of impressive artworks. And to have this piece by Heinrich Isaac is a significant piece because it reflects their cosmopolitan nature. And much of the artists, music, architects, and then scholars that come and move throughout Vienna are doing exactly that for the empire. Now, I did promise that we would move in time, even if we're looking at music in the late Renaissance, the early Baroque, we would really be neglect to ignore Mozart at this point. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart comes to Vienna as a young child, a prodigy, but as an adult, he comes to make his life there because the court wants his skills and abilities as a symphonic composer, composing symphonies for entertainment purposes, string quartets, songs, but it's all about opera, really. And Mozart, much like Isaac, represents to the Habsburg court this Italian style that is the most high art style of the time. Mozart's relationships with the court and the princes and dukes are tenuous at times, but they do allow him, as represented in a very historically fictional-based film, Amadeus, to marry his wife Costanze there against the prohibitions and workarounds from his father, who didn't want this marriage to happen and tried to get the aristocracy to essentially say absolutely not. But he does get married in Stephansdom. Mozart's two children were baptized in the baptismal font on one of the side chapels. This is towards the end of his life. He dies in 1791. And Mozart's funeral was in a side chapel. It's currently referred to as Eugene's Chapel. It is sometimes Chapel of the Cross. It has many names throughout the time. But in 1791, he is memorialized there before taken to a common grave, not a pauper's grave, which is kind of the common lore that Mozart was so poor and destitute that he gets dumped into, pardon my crassness, into a commoner's grave. It was actually common, unless you were high nobility, to be buried in common graves and then have your memorial placed elsewhere. So he did not die from syphilitic fever. It was more likely a rheumatoid fever, which would have been very common of the era. Yes, he was a debtor, and B, he was placed in a common grave, but that was befitting of his station. But also in 1791, when he dies and his funeral is conducted here in the chapel, he leaves one of the most beautiful pieces of music, a requiem. And this requiem is then passed around, it's incomplete. And when it is finally completed, it is performed also in our beautiful cathedral here. So I'd like to let us think of Mozart's relationship to Stephansdom in Vienna in the words of the beginning of his requiem: grant them eternal rest, Lord, and let the perpetual light shine on them. This is the text we'll hear at the very beginning. With Mozart's works, we have the influence of opera in everything from a string quartet to a requiem, which should be performed either in a concert hall or in a church setting. And this is something we'll come back to in a moment. But also, so my students will tell you that happens all the time. It's usually me tripping. But so, also, one of the most common functions of Stephansdom now, it is an active and practicing cathedral, of course, and the archbishop's seat. But if you have, when you have visited Vienna and you go to the center, you will see placards out front that say, visiting Saint so-and-so's high school choir from Nebraska. Or you will find the Children's Youth Orchestra of Bulgaria, or the music club from Siberia. It is also rented out, much like Carnegie Hall, for performances from age ranges from earliest ability to sing to oldest ability to sing, and it's somewhat of a democratic space for music making in that sense, but also for the professional orchestras, ensembles, and amateur orchestras and ensembles of the city. It looms large physically, and it also looms large musically still. And one of the cool things I learned recently is the spire, the tower, has been used, and this transitions very well to invasions, for militaristic observation and watch since about the 1660s. And so when we look at this image, which is a similar rendering of the city, it's from the 1680s, and this is an image from an Ottoman artist imaging the city from the 1680s, from the second attempted invasion by the Ottoman Empire. And one of the common lores, there's a lot of common lores about Turkish citizens or the Ottoman Empire in Vienna, but the Ottoman Empire tries to invade twice. They never quite get there, they're pushed back, but there is a common and regular influx of what we today call Turkish citizens in Vienna, but also citizens from the Mediterranean world that were influenced by the Ottoman Empire. And this adds one more layer to the multilingual cosmopolitan city that is Vienna, because it's not just kind of guest workers coming in after the war, which is a very common thing in German and Austrian cities. Post-World War II, we have guest workers that come in and do the labor that needs to be completed, that can't be completed by the young population that has been essentially wiped out. And so we bring in guest workers, they're ill-treated, and this is a political issue for another topic by one of my colleagues. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, very ill-treated, and yet there is a lingering Turkish community that kind of has a questionable relationship with Austrian and or German citizenship. But in the 1700s, in the 18th and 19th centuries, there is an enmeshment of Turkish folks or folks from the Mediterranean world in Vienna that starts with invasions, but then continues to mutually beneficial trade agreements. The Ottoman Empire is kind of the gateway to the trade world from farther east in the Mediterranean. There are diplomatic agreements that bring in entourages of aristocrats, of diplomats, of trade officials, and then there are the infusion of workers, musicians, shopkeepers. And so the relationship starts with an invasion and a little bit of antipathy, but it kind of continues on to oftentimes a mutually beneficial relationship, and then it gets testy later. One of the other important things that the Ottomans' invasion bring is kind of opening doors to folks who had been affected by Ottoman invasions. And by that I mean Sephardic Jews who had come with the Ottomans as they move from originally in Spain, then kind of moving across Europe and finding homes in the Ottoman Empire or the Ottoman territories. And Ashkenazi Jews from the Mediterranean world find homes at this time. And of course, this is a great, important wealth and history in Vienna for music, art, literature, and general citizenry that both, like the Turks, have a very complicated relationship in Vienna before World War II, and then of course afterwards. But with the Ottomans, one of the cool things is because when we have a so-called exotic influence, it gets somewhat fetishized by the culture. And so in the 18th century, there are, moving with the diplomats and particularly the ceremonial kind of interactions between the courts of the Habsburgs and then Ottoman representatives, is the Ottoman representatives would often move with what begins to be known as Janissary music or Turkish military styles, but they're called merta or mertan, singular for musicians, and then the group of musicians. And their music is characterized by the use of cymbals for centuries built, made, and evolved in Turkey, but also some types of trumpets. And you'll hear in the recording I have in just a second, it kind of sounds like an oboe performed in a very nasal and loud dynamic. And there's lots of regular rhythm and interplay in these timbres. And this becomes something that our well-known composers, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and those before them, they're like, wow, what a cool sound. I can, build this into my music in certain ways. So our first example is from a piece performed by a modern Janissary ensemble, replicating these 14th to 16th century military styles, and it still goes on as ceremonial practices. It's just a very short clip. There are hundreds of styles depending on the military band and organization, but this the almost oompa-like rhythm that is of kind of also akin to Austro-German secular styles are kind of music's performed in bands or regional ensembles, a little bit akin to it, but those cymbals are totally different. Cymbals make their way into the European orchestra through Turkey. This is one of the ways. Haydn has a piece, Symphony 100, called the Military Symphony, And the military symphony has a number of different connotations, but the very end, the fourth movement, which we're going to listen to an excerpt of, he includes these timbre-like symbols that on one hand, if we were like, oh, well, I've listened to a lot of Beethoven and a lot of symphonies, symbols are normal. They weren't normal at this time. And Haydn includes them and makes notes in his kind of day diaries about the really exciting timbre that symbols could bring to the end of a symphony. Mozart has the very famous piano piece, Rondo alla Turk, where he takes some of these rhythmic ideas and integrates them into a piano piece. And then Beethoven, in a couple of different places, but a very, very famous portion in the world famous and accepted Symphony No. 9, has a section that is a Turkish march. And so we'll listen to a little bit of Haydn, hearing these influences, yes, on the one on the left. So as that fades out, we have the influences of the Turkish musicians. There are specific locations in the city where Turkish diplomats would have lived, and then Turkish merchants in particular. Those of you who have visited Vienna, did you visit the world famous Naschmarkt? This like very long strip of food markets where you can like taste food from all over the world. And there's, in the modern instantiation of it, there's a ton of Turkish vendors who sell like dried figs and dates and beautiful candies. And I mean, if you love to eat, like just go there. That's not me. But Naschmarkt begins its modern conception in the 1880s because there had been kind of just on the other side of the river, a quote unquote farmer's market where you could sell things essentially that weren't sanctioned in the city, outside of the city. And often the folks that get associated with selling things that aren't officially sanctioned by like the emperor are Jewish folks in Jewish ethnicity, Turkish immigrants, and other immigrant communities. It's like a wealth of bad stereotypes and beautiful culture mixed together, but it then becomes sanctioned in the city and comes. And so often in these markets selling food and other goods, there were small janissary ensembles that you could walk by. And of course, you're going to walk by with your friends. You're going to go to the coffee house and you walk by and you hear these. If you are Mozart or Haydn, you are attending diplomatic and civil ceremonial events where you hear this music as part of the entry music. So you could hear it in the city and you could hear it in the Hofburg, the kind of imperial palaces as well. And it was highly sought after. Mozart composes a whole opera called The Abduction at the Seraglio that's essentially like exoticizing a narrative scene where there's abduction by these kind of Turkish soldiers, and it's incredibly beautiful as well. So this is happening as the city is growing, expanding. In the 1770s, because we kind of are jumping on, we have still this walled city. We have the walled city that the Ottoman invaders come. We have the walled city that becomes kind of slowly eroding, if we will. The physical, there we are, slowly eroding. And now I have jumped to imagery that presents to you essentially early 19th century images of a couple of the most famous theaters in town, but both of them have their roots where we were in the 1600s. On the left, we have the what is called the Burgtheater. It's this small building next to the one with the large dome on it. This is inside the ring of the city in the Hofburg, in the imperial palaces. And its original function was a tennis court. It was a tennis court because, as a good noble, I would be executing my physical skills, but very genteelly. I would be then executing my knowledge of poetry, drama, and literature from the Latin to the French to the Italian. And I would also need a place to host balls. So we have a multi-purpose environment here. It becomes the imperial theater, really, and depending on the demands of the ruler, in the 1600s, the 1680s, it becomes a real performance space for theater. And this could be only in Italian because Italian was the style of the court at the time. So in the 1600s, opera begins as a new genre in Italy. And as soon as opera, serious opera, like we would think of with Giuseppe Verdi from the 19th century, it becomes a commodity. And the commodity is a place where you can gamble. It is a place where you can see your favorite divo or diva on stage performing their best aria. It becomes a commodity because then trade deals occur in the lobbies when you're not hearing that famous aria. You go out and you talk to your friends and you make a deal. And it becomes a place to be seen and to see and be seen. And so with the Burgtheater on the left, it becomes a home for Italian opera, but also the importance in the 1700s then is, well, Italian might be lingua franca for opera, but the French, they're doing something new, and they're putting ballets on stage with opera. And Louis XIV, in all his might and power, is building all of these palaces. He's getting musicians from around the world to create a French style. So we cannot be left out. We need a German style of opera. This is the Singspiel, and the Singspiel is developed for primarily in Austria, in Vienna, the Burgtheater, and it is a place, this style is a cross between sung arias and then spoken drama. And of course, we have Latinate poetry being translated to German to then do Orpheus and Eurydice auf Deutsch, or newly composed that highlight one of the key things that's very important in establishing a German identity is the myths, the kind of ethnic folk tales that come out. So we get a lot of myths about the very famous Erlkönig that comes out in Goethe later, but this idea of there is a mysterious forest and there is a mysterious entity that comes through the forest to take away the sick and ill children. Really light stuff. And so we get these myths and folk tales that come of enchanted forests, that come of castles and battles that are put in the German language for the German audience. And with the Habsburg dynasty trying to establish their center in Vienna for the expansion of their lands into the Slovak regions, into Ukraine, they want, into Turkey, they want, and over, of course, into Italy. This way to do this is with language and theater to promote your excellence and to show that you are cosmopolitan. The theater over on the right is called the Kantner Tor Theater, or the Carthaginian Gate Theater. And what this one does is really fantastic, is it also does Italian opera because it's the lingua franca of the day. It supports also performances of string quartets, of solo singers. And so it becomes a multi-use facility. And I bring both of these up and you're like, well, you said they both kind of do the same thing. Yes, but they grow differently. And so the Burgtheater, it has a little bit of a nefarious past with burning down and then getting rebuilt, burning down. And then when we get to the 1800s, the emperor decides, well, we need something totally new and it needs a new function. But if we move here, we have our original structure, and it becomes the home for what is known as the court opera and orchestra. And this is important in the civic function and the building life of Vienna, because Vienna is beginning to change. We still have, in the 1770s and 80s, the walled structure, but it's beginning to be dismantled. And this is important as we move on. But what it does is it establishes the primacy of Maria Theresia of Austria, the first queen of the Habsburg Empire. And the way she raises or has her son educated is in a patron of the arts kind of model. And so she promotes, and then her son, Mozart in particular, and Italian opera, promotes the creation of the German Singspiel, and then really kind of highlights the importance of this as a civic trade tool as well. And so we have this original theater. It burns and gets rebuilt, as I said, burns and gets rebuilt, but it then becomes what exists today. This is the Burg Theater today. It was begun in the 1880s, sponsored by the Emperor Joseph. And what he intended it to do is no longer take on the opera function, but be only for the establishment of a German language theater. So we are transitioning from our empire is French, and it is also Italian in nature, and it is also cosmopolitan too. We have to establish ourselves as a German and Austrian theater, and we have to establish a national identity. And this theater does this. It has a famous and nefarious past during the Nazi time, a very famous performance of the name is escaping me now, Shakespeare play. It'll come back to me in a second. What they do is take some of these plays that have The Merchant of Venice. There it is. Thank you. The Merchant of Venice. So they take plays and works that have historical depictions of Jewish characters and use them as propagandistic tools to overemphasize the stereotype of the Jew, and then use it as an educational model to educate against the Jewish population. So it has that nefarious past. It was then bombed, one of the sites that was bombed, and it was then beginning to be rebuilt in the 50s. It exists today. It is across from the Rathaus, or the courthouse structure, where there's a very, very famous Weihnachtsmarkt, Christmas market. Also, I mean, that's a topic for a different time. But we should all go there together, and we should probably have cake after this as well. Yeah. But so the court opera started here, was taken away from here, and then becomes what we call the state opera. But in a very complicated history, that state opera comes from the musicians who performed at the Kärntnertor. And so they have these mixing of ensembles. So they hired tons and tons of, I should just say hundreds and hundreds of musicians to be trained in schools, established music schools, and then to perform only for the state functions of opera. So this theater, of course, existed before. In the 1600s, begins and expands its central role in the city in the 1700s. And that physical structure was deemed not, it didn't have enough capacity and capabilities, and that as we think of revitalizing the city in the 1860s, really 1880s, this building then gets sold by the emperor to create new apartments, and one of the most famous landmarks in Vienna, the Hotel Sacher. Have we sampled the Sacher Torte before? The very famous chocolate cake with a little apricot jam in the middle. I mean, it's delightful. So this becomes the Sacher Hotel, which is, if we look at the front of the new building, directly behind it. So the pre-existing structure was largely dismantled, but it was to bring new life into the city for a grander, more expansive hall that today is the State Opera. And this building, this is the image on the far right is the image from their website, their official site. It is also the place for balls which we'll come to towards the end. But it then takes on this huge role in the musical life of the city. It is for opera, of course, but one of the kind of most famous kind of transition periods is Beethoven's works were performed, his only opera Fidelio, by the state opera or the court opera. We have performances at the small theater of some of the most famous art songs of the time by Franz Schubert, who is a native Viennese. And some of the most famous performances that are built into the state opera complex is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And we know Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which we'll hear in just a second, is this monumental landmark in the 1820s because it takes the state opera orchestra and says, I want to do something different. And he adds that chorus in. So the chorus of the state opera then gets put with the symphony, and it sits there for 4 movements. Well, the first part of the 4th movement. And then it rises at the second part of the 4th movement. And Beethoven's music, the state opera orchestra historians and then the orchestra historians tell us Beethoven's music is essential in changing the structures of the halls available from this small hall, the small hall we saw before, to the building of this new hall, and transitioning the orchestra to an ensemble that only accompanies state operatic functions and then our contract workers to a performative professional ensemble that has to be established because Beethoven's music set a whole new standard for symphonies. And they need these buildings and structures to change so they have different separate purposes, different separate civic ensembles. So this is our most famous image of the fiery composer. And we know that Beethoven makes his first trip to Vienna in 1787 to study explicitly with Mozart. That was a fraught relationship, and he studies with him for a little bit, studies for a little bit with Haydn, but then Beethoven's mother gets ill and he moves back to Bonn in Germany to take care of her. And then in 1792, he secures patrons in Vienna to support his musical life. And Beethoven, it is not too much to say, changes the musical life and structure of Vienna, even though we still have court-supported, imperial-supported musical life and structures. It's because his symphonies asked something rhetorically of music and musicians that others hadn't. It asked to be performed all 4 movements together and to be considered as a whole piece of music. The most common way that we would get concerts prior to Beethoven was the overture to an opera to start us off. And then you all would perform for us a beautiful song cycle. And then you all would come to us with your string quartet movement. And then we would come to the end of the concert and we would end with a fiery end of a totally different symphony. It took the movements of the symphony apart. They existed as one whole composition, but we were like, we don't need to perform it together. We have this hodgepodge of concerts that keeps all of our attention, and it's not just one kind of homogeneous ensemble. Beethoven, through his patrons, changes that, and it changes the expectations of musicians who need to be much more specialized in symphonic works. And with this, we get the establishment of, Staatsopera is a different step. I'm going to move forward and then come back. The establishment of the essentially what we call the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra, because it started originally with the court opera musicians who would be contracted to play for Beethoven's symphonies, and then they as a group, they have a quote unquote democratic model, and they decided that they could establish an ensemble that could be supported by subscriptions monetarily and it would be supported by the emperor. And that then evolved into a sole orchestra, democratically elected and auditioned, that then inhabits the most famous musical landmark for non-opera is the Musikverein, or it's essentially the music club, is a very gross generalization of what it means. but it is a group of musicians that works together in this highly professional way that elects their performers, their conductor, and then their administration. This is problematic during the Anschluss, the lead up to the Nazi time and during World War II, because they, through political prohibition, elect to eject all Jewish members, and they elect to then perform propagandistic music that can support the life of their hall and ensemble during that time. And the other problematic sense is they have democratically chosen not to admit women or people of different ethnicities until the 80s and 90s. They're working on it, and they are working on it now, but it is not without its problems as well. So I bring us an interjection back to the Staatsoper because we are running towards the end. And the Staatsoper, the building we looked at previous to this, is home to like the world famous conductors of their era, Gustav Mahler being one. Gustav Mahler also had a tenure with the New York Philharmonic. And he represents to Vienna a number of things, a modernizing. So he, at this time, brings first full, complete performances of Wagner operas. Up until that point in Vienna, they had been extracted, so in movements or in symphonic settings. He works both with the Staatsoper and with the Musikverein as conductors. And Mahler is from what we would call Bohemia or Moravia. He has a Jewish background. And to get the job in Vienna at the Staatsoper, he had a bunch of anti-Semitic prohibitions. He converted to Christianity. He was a secular Jew, and he was like, I want the job. It doesn't matter that much to me. I'm a deep and embedded citizen of Vienna. He then grows the space, the ensembles, the people, and the quality of both the opera and the orchestra. And he's world beloved, but essentially he's pushed out in 1907. He takes a job in New York, and basically his health deteriorates in New York, and he passes away. But that was an excerpt of his Symphony No. 5, the Adagietto, by a famous American conductor in Vienna, Leonard Bernstein, which we might all want to watch the new documentary or docu-film about Leonard Bernstein, Maestro, that's coming out soon. But it's this rich history, and he is now just hailed and beloved in Vienna and throughout Europe, of course. And will you advance me? And I will advance us a little bit. One of the downsides is there are probably 100 composers that we all love, and conductors and musicians that we are not going to be able to address. Johannes Brahms is key to the reshaping of the city. But I'll end with a notion that the imperial court has a conscious modernizing of Vienna as a city, and it doesn't want to be seen as a backwater holdout with a medieval wall. And they begin in earnest tearing down the wall in the 1860s and building a modern style of architecture that is very famously associated with the liberalizing government, which meant they wanted a unified look to the city, which is where we get, and I apologize, a very small image of what's known as the Ringstrasse today. We take down that old wall, we build a boulevard that has the public transit, the trams that are so accessible and walkable, green space around. And then we have the imperial palaces that build up, that become our museums, that become the centers of government for the city and the state. And then we get all of the transition of green spaces that were hunting or parade grounds into then public spaces with a somewhat uniformed look to the city. And then the public transit leading into the center, where we started with Stephansdom, then becomes kind of the focal point. All points lead into the center, and then the Danube on the outside. This also led, of course, to the era of Freud, the era of psychology and psychoanalysis, the era of Jugendstil literature and building. Artists like Gustav Klimt make their home in Vienna and make their physical imprint on buildings in the city. And it becomes a center for not only tourism, which it had been, a new center for tourism for younger, modern artists and thinkers to create this kind of what they call a liberal environment at the time. It is then home to modern music that causes scandals, and I will wrap up here. It is home to balls and waltzes by the Strausses, which perhaps we will. And during the Lenten, lead up to the Lenten season, we have cotillion-style balls that are both coming of age ceremonies, entertainment that you can still participate in. And we will see.
Das sind Blumenradeln. Also ich habe ja den Begriff Reserverat geprägt, aber das wollte die Maria nicht hören. Wie pulsierende Blumen. Jetzt stehen die Herren in der Mitte und halten ihre Hände wie einen Blütenstempel.
Okay, so the best video is from the opera ball itself. This transforms the interior of the state opera. It transforms the interior of the Musikverein, of some of these imperial palaces into balls. And as he said, the beautiful choreography with the men standing in the middle, with the women holding flowers on the outside, all choreographed, all well planned, and the tickets are selling out already. As we end, the other physical places we would need to see in this city are, and it's a little moribund, the cemeteries. The Central Friedhof and the Jüdische Friedhof have monuments to composers, artists, musicians, scholars, and they're very well visited. We could take a tour of where Mozart lived, where Beethoven lived, and others. Along the Ringstrasse, there are monuments to Mozart, Mahler, the Strausses extraordinaire, and others. And then images here I have of archives and museums. This is one of the Hofburg palaces that was built on top of the old grounds. It leads us into, if we walked to the left, it would lead us into the central part of the city. But here we have a fantastic museum of historical musical instruments. This is a Google Maps shot of today's Vienna. We can see even on this small readout the rings that still exist and the places we have visited make up the landscape of Vienna that exists. And sometimes their structures change. Sometimes there are hundreds of churches in and outside of this ring, and they all held music of different settings. All of the palaces, functionaries, business buildings held music. And so it's a place that kind of keeps alive. And there's a ton of evolving, like wild and crazy stuff going on today, jazz scenes, rock, punk, you name it. Vienna is living it, but this is our view. And I appreciate you today, and I'm here for questions.
That was quite a musical ride. Are there any questions or comments?
Let's go.
Just get it started here. You ought to be hired by the Chamber of Commerce of Vienna. Oh, right. Something that motivated my comment is Mozart dying as a pauper, the debtor. When did things change in history in the Middle Ages, or more closely to us then. When did society start accepting our heroes, for music, the composers and the artists, performance people? When did they finally be recognized enough to be financially stable and successful instead of dying as paupers, as most starving artists are concerned today?
Well, I think many would tell you that's still a struggle, as you well expected, right? So things change with Beethoven a little bit because Mozart was still supported and funded by the imperial structure. It was possible for him to overspend on an allowance for an opera and run into debt and then be responsible for it, or not pay taxes and then be responsible for the debt. With Beethoven, we get a system of patronage that had existed but changes, that says, here is your living allowance, here is your house, here is your, something to support you as a genius artist. And so this trope of genius really, it exists before, but it gets fostered with Beethoven. And yes, he did have issues and financial issues, but with Beethoven, it changes. For others to be able to make a living, it depends on printing. So even if we move back to the Renaissance, the ability to have your music printed and then benefit from the profits changes. So that happens a little bit later. We associate that typically in the 19th century with Giuseppe Verdi, who's one of the first composers to ask for royalties on the performances of his opera, demand royalties in his contract on royalties of his opera, and they're holding the rights to the printing. Typically, a publisher of Mozart's music, Breitkopf and Härtel, is a very famous German publisher, they would buy a symphony from him. Let's say they give him the equivalent of 500 euros, and then he's done with it, and they make the profit. And so this is one of the issues as well. With Beethoven, he begins to get profits from his printing of his music. And so that's where it starts to change in the 19th century. But realistically, the mechanisms are set up for artists, and performers are a different category as subservient to fill in the blank, us, the consumers. Yeah. Beethoven is the major one.
Anything else? Yes.
While we're moving the mic, there's a question that says, spell the name of the first composer.
Oh, yes, Heinrich, Heinrich, Isaac, Isaac, like Isaac.
I just have a comment. 15 years or so ago, Carol and I visited Vienna, and we were able to find the house where her grandmother was born, the church where she was baptized, and on the way back to the ship, we stopped at a little bar because if you buy beer, you can use their bathroom.
Absolutely.
The bar was run by Turks, and the whole neighborhood where our grandmother was born is now a Turkish enclave.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's in the past 20 years I've been visiting, you can see this shift and changes. One of the things, non-musical but supportive of civil and society that can then afford and buy into entertainment, is Vienna has a very generous public housing policy. And so when we get immigrants who might not make as much as, a banker, right? We have kind of a generous policy, and then we grow out the neighborhoods with new communities. That is, of course, a tension, and I'll leave it very neutrally at that. But it's you see the shifts and changes when you haven't been back in 5 years, and you're like, oh wow, this is all brand new. This is now, today it would be a Ukrainian village, right? We might see. Yeah, I totally understand this experience.
Well, this has been great, and that's actually kind of a nice lead-in to what we're going to be talking about next week, which is the more cosmopolitan nature of Vienna, how immigrants are assimilated, neighborhoods created. It'll be a very interesting time, and thank you for that lead-in, Morgan.
Anything I can do.
Yeah. This has been delightful. I'm glad you could be here. Next week, come back to Vienna for another and different look. Thank you.